The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Sweetwater's main street as the stagecoach rolled to a stop, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the still air. Elizabeth Morgan stepped down carefully, her worn travelling dress doing little to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She clutched a small carpetbag close to her chest, surveying the town that would either become her salvation or her final downfall. The building stood weathered and practical, false-fronted stores lining both sides of the wide dirt road. Cowboys lounged outside the general store, their conversations stopping as they watched her pass. Elizabeth kept her gaze forward, her heart pounding beneath her modest collar. She had traveled 300 miles to escape her past, leaving behind a life in San Antonio that had crumbled around her 6 months ago. Here, in this frontier town where nobody knew her story, she could start fresh. The Golden Rose Saloon stood at the end of the street, its painted sign faded by countless Texas summers. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, had responded to Elizabeth's letter, offering her a position serving drinks and keeping the books. It wasn't the life she'd once dreamed of, but it was honest work, and right now, that was all that mattered. Here, in this frontier town where nobody knew her story, she could start fresh. The Golden Rose Saloon stood at the end of the street, its painted sign faded by countless Texas summers. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, had responded to Elizabeth's letter, offering her a position serving drinks and keeping the books. It wasn't the life she'd once dreamed of, but it was honest work, and right now, that was all that mattered. James Crawford had built his ranch from nothing, spending 15 years turning scrubland into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in West Texas. At 38, he commanded respect throughout Sweetwater, his word carrying weight in business matters and town decisions. He sat at his usual corner table in the Golden Rose, reviewing contracts with his foreman when the new woman brought their coffee. Her hands shook slightly as she set down the cups, careful not to spill a drop. James noticed the calluses on her fingers, the kind that came from hard work, not the soft hands of someone used to being served. Over the following weeks, he found himself returning more often than necessary, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Elizabeth moved through the saloon with quiet dignity, never encouraging the rowdier patrons, but never showing fear either. She had a way of deflecting unwanted attention with a polite word and a firm step backward. One evening, as James prepared to leave, he overheard two cattlemen discussing her. They speculated about her past, why a woman of obvious education would work in a saloon, what she might be running from. James felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. The next afternoon, he arrived to find Elizabeth in the back room, poring over the account books with intense concentration. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned the books were finally in order for the first time in years. James cleared his throat, and Elizabeth looked up startled. For a moment their eyes met, and James saw something that made his chest tighten, a mixture of hope and fear, strength and vulnerability. He tipped his hat and left, but the image stayed with him all the way back to his ranch, troubling his thoughts long into the night. The summer heat intensified as June arrived, turning Sweetwater into a furnace during midday hours. Elizabeth had settled into a rhythm, her work at the Golden Rose providing just enough to rent a small room above the seamstress shop. She'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, her past would stay buried 300 miles away. Then Marcus Brennan walked through the saloon doors. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. Marcus had been a business associate of her late husband in San Antonio, a man who knew everything about her former life. She ducked into the back room, her breath coming in short gasps, but she knew it was only a matter of time. That evening, as she walked home through the darkening streets, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to find James Crawford, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. He'd noticed her distress, he explained, and wanted to ensure she reached home safely. Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. The words tumbled out in a desperate whisper, how she'd been married to a merchant in San Antonio, how he'd squandered their money on failed investments and left her with nothing but debts when he abandoned her, how she'd worked as a governess but lost the position when creditors spread rumors about her character, how she'd come here for a fresh start, knowing that a woman with a failed marriage and financial scandal in her past would never be accepted in proper society. James listened without judgment, his steady presence somehow making the confession easier. When she finished, silence hung between them. Finally, James spoke, his voice low and sincere, telling her that in Texas, what mattered was who you were now, not who you'd been. Word spread quickly through small towns, and Marcus Brennan wasted no time sharing carefully crafted versions of Elizabeth's story. He painted her as a woman of questionable character, someone who'd fled debt and responsibility. The whispers started subtly, conversations that stopped when Elizabeth entered a room, glances that lingered too long at church. Mrs. Henderson stood by her employee firmly, but even her support couldn't stop the gossip entirely. James found himself defending Elizabeth's reputation in conversations at the general store, at the bank, during cattle dealings. His vocal support only fueled more speculation, with townsfolk wondering why the town's most eligible bachelor would involve himself with a woman of uncertain past. His sister Margaret, visiting from Dallas, warned him that his reputation was at stake. She didn't understand why he'd risk everything for a saloon worker he barely knew. But James had seen something in Elizabeth that others missed, a quiet strength, an unwillingness to let circumstances break her spirit. He began spending more time in town, often appearing wherever Elizabeth might need an ally. When the general store owner's wife made a cutting remark about certain women who bring scandal wherever they go, James calmly moved his considerable business to the competing store across the street. The message was clear. One Sunday after church, James approached Elizabeth as she walked alone. He asked if she'd allow him to call on her properly, to accompany her to the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to say yes more than anything, but she knew what it would cost him. The whole town would talk. His standing in the community would suffer. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them see. Don't let them know how much this means to me." James Crawford had never been a man who backed down from doing what he believed was right, even when it wasn't easy. His success hadn't come from following the comfortable path, but from making hard choices and standing by them. That night, sitting on his ranch porch watching the stars spread across the vast Texas sky, he thought about Elizabeth's whispered plea. She was trying to protect him, to spare him from the gossip and social complications that came with openly courting her. But James had spent too many years building a life of material success while his heart remained empty. He'd watched friends marry for social advantage, creating households of mutual convenience rather than genuine partnership. He'd told himself he was too busy, that the ranch demanded all his attention. The truth was, he'd never met anyone who made him want something more, until now. The next morning, he rode into town with clear purpose. He stopped first at the newspaper office, placing an announcement for the Founders' Day edition. Then he visited the mayor, the bank president, and several prominent business owners, making his intentions known before gossip could twist them. By noon, all of Sweetwater knew that James Crawford intended to court Elizabeth Morgan publicly, and that he'd welcome any man to speak his objections directly rather than whisper behind his back. Elizabeth heard the news while organizing inventory in the saloon storage room. Mrs. Henderson delivered it with a knowing smile, watching as Elizabeth's hands stilled on the whiskey bottles she'd been counting. "He's putting his reputation on the line for you," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "The question is, are you brave enough to let him?" Elizabeth's mind raced with all the reasons this was impossible, all the ways it could go wrong. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but undeniably real. Founders' Day arrived with clear blue skies and a welcome breeze that offered relief from the usual heat. The entire town gathered in the square, where tables laden with food stretched beneath makeshift awnings. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with fiddle music and conversation. Elizabeth had debated staying home, but Mrs. Henderson insisted she deserved to be there like any other member of the community. James had sent word that he'd meet her at 2 o'clock by the bandstand. Elizabeth wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton she'd carefully pressed the night before. As the appointed time approached, her stomach tightened with nervousness. She could feel eyes on her, hear the whispers that seemed to follow wherever she went. James appeared exactly on time, looking dignified in a dark suit that contrasted with his sun-weathered face. He offered his arm, and Elizabeth took it, feeling the strength beneath the fabric. They walked together toward the center of the celebration, and gradually, conversations around them quieted. Marcus Brennan stood near the lemonade table, surrounded by several townsmen. His voice carried clearly across the square, as he made pointed comments about propriety and the kind of women respectable men should associate with. Elizabeth felt James's arm tense beneath her hand. She wanted to disappear, to spare him this public scrutiny. Mayor Thompson approached the bandstand to begin the official ceremonies, calling for everyone's attention. As the crowd gathered closer, Marcus positioned himself prominently, clearly planning to cause a scene. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She leaned close to James, her voice barely a whisper filled with desperation. "Please," she breathed. "Please don't let them see. Don't let them see how much this hurts, how much I care, how afraid I am." But James Crawford had already made his decision. James Crawford stepped forward, his movement deliberate and unhurried. The crowd's murmur died instantly, hundreds of eyes turning toward the tall rancher who commanded respect through years of fair dealing and honest work. He didn't release Elizabeth's hand. Instead, he held it more firmly, raising their joined hands slightly so everyone could see. The town fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the importance of the moment, their games pausing mid-motion. James's voice carried across the square, steady and clear, without anger, but with unmistakable conviction. He spoke about second chances, about how Texas had been built by people escaping failed ventures elsewhere, seeking new opportunities in untamed land. He reminded them that many of Sweetwater's founding families had arrived with nothing but determination and a willingness to work hard. He talked about character being measured not by where someone came from, but by how they conducted themselves when faced with adversity. He acknowledged that Elizabeth had faced difficulties in her past, that she'd made the courageous choice to start over rather than give up. He stated plainly that he'd never met anyone with more dignity, more honest work ethic, or more genuine kindness than Elizabeth Morgan. Then James did something that made several women gasp. He looked directly at Marcus Brennan and spoke with quiet intensity. He said that any man who found satisfaction in tearing down a woman trying to rebuild her life was showing his own weakness, not hers. That gossip was the refuge of small minds and smaller hearts. The silence deepened, broken only by the flutter of bunting in the breeze. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, stepping forward. He'd known James since the rancher first arrived in Sweetwater with nothing but a horse and ambition. If James Crawford vouched for someone's character, that carried considerable weight. What happened next surprised even James. Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher and one of Sweetwater's most respected women, stepped forward. She'd been watching Elizabeth for weeks, she announced, ever since Mrs. Henderson asked her to tutor some of the saloon owner's younger relatives. Elizabeth had volunteered her time to help, showing patience and skill with the children that came from genuine care. Sarah declared that she'd be honored to call Elizabeth a friend. One by one, others joined her, The baker's wife mentioned how Elizabeth always paid her bills promptly despite modest means. The elderly widow Patterson recalled how Elizabeth had helped her carry groceries during a rainstorm, refusing any payment. Even some of the cowboys who frequented the Golden Rose spoke up, praising her fairness and how she'd helped them write letters home when they struggled with words. Not everyone stepped forward. Some remained silent, their disapproval clear in crossed arms and tight lips. Marcus Brennan left the gathering entirely, his attempt to shame Elizabeth having backfired spectacularly. But enough people had spoken that the tide had visibly turned. Mayor Thompson officially welcomed Elizabeth to the community, and the celebration resumed with renewed energy, as if the town had collectively decided to put the tension behind them. James and Elizabeth found themselves surrounded by well-wishers, some apologizing for their earlier coldness, others simply offering genuine welcomes. Mrs. Henderson appeared with 2 plates of food, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. She'd known all along, she whispered to Elizabeth, that good people recognize their own kind eventually. As the afternoon stretched toward evening and the fiddle music grew livelier, James led Elizabeth to a quieter spot, beneath an old oak tree at the square's edge. The shadows were lengthening, painting everything in golden light. 3 months passed like a gentle stream flowing toward something larger. James courted Elizabeth properly, with Sunday buggy rides through the countryside and quiet dinners at his ranch, where his housekeeper served as chaperone. Elizabeth discovered that beneath his serious exterior, James had a dry sense of humor and a thoughtful way of seeing the world. He learned that she loved reading, that she'd once dreamed of opening a school, that she had a talent for mathematics that made his ranch bookkeeping significantly more efficient. Sweetwater slowly accepted what James had declared that day in the square. Elizabeth's quiet dignity won over even some of the initial skeptics. She continued working at the Golden Rose, but Mrs. Henderson gradually shifted her responsibilities toward managing the books entirely, a position that carried more respect. On a crisp October evening, James proposed under that same oak tree where they'd stood during Founders' Day. He didn't offer flowery speeches or grand promises. Instead, he simply told her that she'd made him believe in partnership, in building something together that was stronger than what either could create alone. Elizabeth said yes with tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of joy, not fear. The wedding took place in early November, a simple ceremony attended by most of the town. Sarah Mitchell stood as Elizabeth's witness, and Mayor Thompson performed the service. As James and Elizabeth exchanged vows, promising to face whatever challenges came with honesty and courage, the autumn sunlight streamed through the church windows, painting everything in warm gold. They'd both learned that second chances weren't given freely. They were earned through courage, supported by allies, and built on the foundation of being true to oneself. Elizabeth Morgan Crawford had arrived in Sweetwater with nothing but a carpet bag and hope. She'd found something far more valuable, a home, a community, and a love worth every risk she'd taken to claim it. Winter settled over Sweetwater with cold winds that swept across the open rangeland, rattling windows and reminding everyone that Texas weather could be as harsh as it was beautiful. Elizabeth adjusted to life at the Crawford Ranch with a mixture of excitement and challenge. The house was spacious but showed years of bachelor living, functional but lacking warmth. She spent her first weeks as Mrs. Crawford organizing, cleaning, and gradually adding touches that transformed the space into a true home. Fresh curtains appeared in the windows, books lined newly built shelves, and the smell of home-cooked meals replaced the previous reliance on the ranch cook's basic fare. James watched these changes with quiet appreciation, often catching himself simply observing Elizabeth as she moved through their home, still amazed that she was truly his wife. But marriage brought complications neither had fully anticipated. The ranch demanded James's constant attention, particularly as calving season approached. He'd leave before dawn and return after dark, exhausted and covered in dust. Elizabeth found herself alone for long stretches, managing the household while learning the rhythms of ranch life. She missed the intellectual stimulation of bookkeeping at the Golden Rose, missed Mrs. Henderson's companionship, the isolation of ranch living. Something James barely noticed after 15 years weighed on her more than she wanted to admit. One evening, as James reviewed cattle counts at the kitchen table, Elizabeth gathered her courage. She proposed an idea that had been forming for weeks. Sweetwater needed a proper school, something beyond the informal lessons Sarah Mitchell provided in her parlor. Elizabeth had the education and the passion. What if they converted the unused barn on the eastern edge of their property? It was close enough to town that children could walk, far enough that it wouldn't interfere with ranch operations. James looked up from his papers, seeing the hope and purpose blazing in his wife's eyes. James supported Elizabeth's vision immediately, but turning dreams into reality required more than enthusiasm. The barn needed extensive repairs, the community needed convincing, and funding had to be secured. Elizabeth threw herself into the project with determination that reminded James why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She spent January visiting families throughout the area, documenting how many children needed education and listening to parents' concerns. Many supported the idea eagerly, tired of their children receiving sporadic lessons or none at all. Others worried about the cost, whether a woman could truly teach older boys, and whether Elizabeth's past made her suitable as an influence on young minds. The latter objection stung, but Elizabeth had learned to face prejudice with grace and persistence. She presented her proposal to the town council in February, armed with enrollment numbers, a detailed budget, and testimonials from families. The discussion grew heated. Councilman Porter, who'd never fully accepted Elizabeth, questioned whether ranch funds should support what he called a personal project. James stood to respond, but Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on his arm. She addressed the council herself, explaining that education benefited everyone, that educated children became productive citizens, that investing in the next generation strengthened the entire community. She wasn't asking for charity. She proposed a tuition system with scholarships for families who couldn't afford payment. Mayor Thompson, impressed by her thorough planning, called for a vote. The school was approved 4-3. As they left the meeting hall, James squeezed Elizabeth's hand. She'd fought her own battle and won, proving to herself and others what he'd always known, that she possessed strength and capability beyond what society typically allowed women to demonstrate. The real work began immediately, with James organizing ranch hands to repair the barn, while Elizabeth ordered supplies and developed curriculum. The school opened in late April, just as wildflowers painted the Texas landscape in brilliant colors. 15 students ranging from 6 to 14 filled the converted barn, sitting at mismatched desks James had purchased from a closing school in a neighboring town. Elizabeth stood before them that first morning, her heart pounding with nervous excitement, and began the most rewarding work of her life. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography with a passion that made even reluctant students eager to learn. Word spread quickly about the quality of education at Crawford School. By June, enrollment had grown to 23, forcing James to add another room to the building. Elizabeth hired Sarah Mitchell as an assistant teacher, creating a partnership that benefited both women and their students. But success brought new tensions. Some townspeople, particularly those who'd voted against the school, resented its growing influence. They spread rumors that Elizabeth was teaching ideas above children's stations, filling their heads with ambitions beyond ranch work and domestic duties. Councilman Porter complained loudly that his nephew had become difficult at home, questioning his father's business practices after learning about ethics in Elizabeth's classroom. The situation came to a head one afternoon when Porter arrived at the school unannounced, demanding to review Elizabeth's teaching materials. He wanted to ensure nothing inappropriate was being taught. Elizabeth maintained her composure, inviting him to observe any lesson, review any book. Porter spent an hour watching Elizabeth teach a history lesson about the founding of Texas, finding nothing objectionable but leaving unsatisfied. That evening, Elizabeth confessed to James her worry that Porter would find a way to cause trouble for the school. James listened carefully, then shared something he'd learned long ago. Opposition often came not from genuine concern, but from people uncomfortable with change, with others' success, with their own limitations being highlighted by someone else's accomplishments. The school was thriving because Elizabeth was exceptional, and some people would always resent that.